maybe since you've brought it up a couple of times now, maybe you could define for us what you mean by the warfare thesis and how did it, what gave birth to it, and why
Yeah.
do you think it sticks so well, at least maybe not like you're saying right now with the actual historical academics, but with lay people? Why is that, I think, the default setting
Yeah.
of modern presumption?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge question. And as far as its sociological components, I don't get into all of it, but the basic argument of my book is that the warfare thesis. So, in a nutshell, the warfare thesis is simply saying that Christianity and science have perennially, almost since the dawn of time, kind of been opposed, right? Christians, they burned down the Library of Alexandria. They persecuted and killed Hypatia of Alexandria, the female philosopher. They condemned Galileo. They burned Servetus at the stake for while John Calvin was giggling as he looked on, and on and on and on. So that the warfare thesis, in a nutshell, is a historically driven idea that Christianity has just always been at odds with the sciences, and the sciences are often painted as almost a Robin Hood figure, this heroic underdog that finally managed to escape its captors and create the much more egalitarian and sanitary life that we have today. Um, so, in a nutshell, one of the interesting things is Christianity has, of course, always had its cultured detractors, but the warfare thesis per se only really began to arise in the 18th and 19th centuries. And a major argument of my book is that what happened, to cut a very long and complicated story short, is that quite interestingly, the idea of the warfare thesis happened to coincide in its birth with the birth of history as a professional university discipline. And these again happen to coincide with the debates over the reception of Darwinism and evolutionary theory at large. And so what happened really is that a mirage takes place, in the sense that because a certain group of people who were the first professional historians had a particular view of things, and why they had that, we can get to that in a moment. Because the fact that they were working with history, they very easily created these stories that gave the illusion of this long pedigree of warfare, when in fact it was quite a new invention. In many instances. And it was new not just in the sense of being wrong in many instances, but a lot of the categories that were being used, like what a religion is and what science is, came to reshape history into their images. And when we have a particular notion of science and particular notion of religion as we tend to use them today, when you stamp an episode like the Galileo affair with those categories, it becomes more or less clear cut that, Galileo is on one side, apparently representing this category of science, and the Catholic Church is obviously on the other side, representing religion. Um, but one of the deconstructions that's really happened is to say that these categories actually, not only are they historically specific, so they only take effect, in mid 19th century per se. Once we dissolve them, science and religion start showing up on all of our previously clear-cut sides, in very curious intermixtures, or what we would today kind of see as intermixtures. Um, and so the warfare thesis really got started with several key individuals in the 19th century, like Thomas Huxley and Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper. And each of them had their own kind of particular personal and institutional beefs that drove a lot of what they saw as the warfare thesis. So they had a tendency to kind of project their own individual circumstances and drape it over all of history, and reshape it into their image. So Christianity, in fact, shaped science in very major ways, but these men had a hand in how we receive these histories. And from there, through the new profession of history, an entire generation or two of academics were trained in these categories that really helped perpetuate the myth. And in fact, they were just trained explicitly in the myth itself, which sort of migrated from these very overtly polemical textbooks into more this kind of dry textbook era in kind of the 1950s America, right? So what was openly polemical sort of became kind of the this is how it's always been textbook-ish type of knowledge, very unassuming, very kind of this is the way things were. So um, it's certainly not the only way that the warfare thesis took off. There's a lot of other angles that we could explore, but the angle I'm really trying to explore is how the arguments around the reception of Darwin and really the emergence of history as a professional university discipline both kind of aided and abetted this universal idea that Christianity and science have always been kind of at loggerheads with one another.
Would it
So,
be fair to say then that what your book sets out to do is debunk the myth that there's been a hot war between faith and science, and in doing so, you uncovered evidence that there is a war between history and faith?
that's a very interesting way of putting it. I would be a little hesitant, just because history as a category too, once you get into the nuts and bolts, that was also a theologically driven category, even in the areas of higher criticism. But as a general rule of thumb, yeah, it's very interesting that we tend to assume that science was the main antagonist. Excuse me. When in fact it's really been history as the discipline that has been kind of the major player in trying to not necessarily debunk Christianity, but certainly overturn some of the more usual assumptions. Um, Whether it be the verbal plenary inspiration of scripture, or the timeline that we of 6,000 years, or what have you. So I wouldn't necessarily want to put it in quite black and white terms, but I think that it's definitely getting us into the right ballpark to say, look, actually it's really history that we need to start looking at. In fact, science was so there. Michael Buckley, who is a Catholic historian, has this great line in his book on the origins of atheism, and he says it amuses him when he sees so many people talking about the warfare of Christianity and science, and he said actually it's the exact opposite. Part of the problem was that Christianity was so intimately fused with the variety of the sciences that when those sciences happened to change, it looked like the Christianity so closely wedded to them also became defunct. Um, so history really is, I think, the driving factor here. And there's a lot of surprises along the way once we kind of shift the lens there.
Well, I'd love to talk specifically about some of the examples that most people believe are evidences of a hot war. You brought up Galileo, Copernicus,
Yeah.
possibly, Bruno, definitely Darwin and the Scopes trial. So maybe we
Yeah.
can come to those. But let me ask you this, as a tail follow up to the question we just kind of jumped into, and that is that history has had more effect on perpetuating the idea of the warfare thesis, and that is, do you think that the men you mentioned, Draper, White, Huxley, do you think their motivation, and I'm not asking you to climb into their minds, and I know you do some of this in your book, but is their motivation a resentment that at the time that science and faith were wedded, did they resent the power relationship that faith had, or that the church
Yeah,
had?
yeah. That's yes. I think the quick and dirty answer is I think that there was certainly some of that. Um, I mean, this quickly gets complicated because, again, like you said, we can't necessarily crawl into their heads. But Thomas Huxley, for example, was a very able individual, incredibly smart, incredibly good at the new discipline of the sciences. So, scientist as a term and as a category wasn't coined until 1832 by an Anglican, William Whewell. And so, but Huxley was continuously denied work because he wasn't a Christian. And during the reign of Anglicanism, you often had to sign confessions of faith, or adhere to certain dogmatic ideas. And Huxley, I think to his credit, wouldn't bend his own morals to do that. And so he was actually, often very, very upset about how often he had been denied work, right? And so in many ways, he came to his animosity against the theologians, quite honestly, even if it wasn't a straightforward science versus religion set piece. Because one of the interesting twists that happens with actually every one of the figures that I talk about in my book and really at large is none of them think that religion and science conflict. All of them are specifically attacking theology instead of religion. And that actually turns out to be a fairly important principle that we can get into later here. But yeah, there is a certain animosity about the power structures that were going on, because the Anglican Church very often did control, if not what was said, certainly who could be saying it. And so, yeah, I think that the idea of looking at the new emerging professional class of scientists, often among whom were Christians aplenty, wanting a sort of occupational independence from the oversight of the Anglican Church, who, I mean, frankly, had no real business, looking over the shoulder when they themselves were not scientists. And so, one of the major reworkings of the warfare thesis is that it was not a clash between science and religion, but it was very often the emergence of a new it was a clash between a younger professional elite and the older established professional elite of the Anglican clergy. And so even just with this slight twist, it really dismantles the warfare thesis, because on all sides we have Christians and on all sides we have agnostics. And so it's not really that religion is seen as opposing science or science as opposing religion. It's kind of it's a power grab in a real way. It's about establishing an occupational independence, and for people like Huxley not to need to sign a statement of faith before they get their test tubes out, so to speak.